Hey everyone, welcome back. So as you can see on the table here, we have the necessary things to create a single Space Marine. We have the sprue of the actual Space Marine itself. We have the clippers that we're going to be using it to clip the pieces off of the sprue. We have the base to put the model on. This one was actually on a separate sprue that I clipped off already. We have a file, a metal file here, as well as an X-Acto knife. So these are the things that I use along with some Loctite super glue to create our miniature from the sprue. So what we're going to do first is go ahead and disassemble or clip off the individual parts of the Space Marine. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your sprue and you're going to use your clippers. Now the clippers come with two sides. Obviously you have a flat side on the back here and then one that's kind of angled. I like to use the flat side. And what I'll do is I'll actually place that up against the model as close as I can, and then all I do is just squeeze and clip that off. And I'll do that for every single individual piece of the miniature. Okay, and then here goes your piece that we cut off. So I'm going to go ahead and clip all of these off, and then we'll be right back. Okay, so as you guys can see, I've kind of fast forwarded the recording just a little bit. I didn't want to bore you guys with watching me clip all the parts, but here are all the parts clipped off and ready for assembly. Now there's a couple of steps that you guys can take. Most people will start assembling the piece together and putting the miniature together first. I personally would like to prep the work, do a little prep work before I assemble the miniature. And by prep work, what I mean is once you've clipped some sections off, like for example the top section over here of the Space Marine torso, or above the legs, above the hip, where the torso sits, you're going to have that little sprue clipping that you clipped off. If you were to put the Space Marine torso together and then try to place that, sometimes that little section right over here might interfere with the miniature sitting flush. So what I like to do is just get my X-Acto knife, and I like to just trim that section off. Okay, and then that way the actual torso will sit nice and neat and flush, so that you don't have any sections in there to interfere. Secondly, what I like to do while the miniature is still unassembled, I like to do a little bit extra prep work in terms of cleaning up the model. You guys can clean up the model by seeing all these little mold lines. Now when these plastic Space Marines, or you can look at resin or pewter, any of these models, whenever they're cast, they're usually cast in a two-part mold, which means that they have two halves of a mold that sit together, and then they put in whatever material, whether it be resin or plastic or pewter. When they extract the actual model off the sprues, you'll get these mold lines. Now you can leave it as is if you're a gamer, but personally I really do think by putting in the extra time to clean up these mold lines will make your overall miniature look great. So on the side here I have a miniature that I had already assembled, and I'm going to show you guys the actual mold lines themselves. Okay, so if you guys can see the mold line here, let me use the X-Acto knife to point. Okay, you can actually see that there's a mold line going down this leg right here. Okay, and for example, here's the clipping sections of the shoulder pad that I didn't clean off. So I assembled this model pretty much untouched after I clipped it, just to demonstrate what the model can look like. Now you can obviously, if you're in a rush, or for most people, they will prime this and then paint this as is. However, like I said, I would like to take the extra time to actually clean it off. And the reason for that is that once you prime the model and you start painting it, you're going to have these lines and everything be accentuated and really show in more detail that there's a flaw in the miniature with lines. So when you're doing shading, the shading will actually pull up on that line where you don't want it to go. You're going to see all these little bumps and divots here and there on the model. So I like to actually take the time and take my X-Acto knife or file. I'll show you guys both. You can actually take the flat side of a file and actually just file it down so that the risen mold line, it disappears and becomes flush with the rest of the armor. Okay, all it takes is 2 seconds to do that. Okay, if you decide that you want to use an X-Acto knife, you can do it in two ways. You can cut it towards yourself or cut it away. I personally think you have more control cutting it towards yourself. It seems a little more dangerous. However, I find that I have more control being able to cut towards me this way rather than cutting away from you. The other method that I have is you can actually take the blade, instead of cutting, put it on its side, and you can actually scrape. You can actually scrape towards you, or you can actually scrape away from you. Now this will dull the blade very quickly. However, you're gonna get a nice clean armor surface that you can actually prime and paint on then. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna clean all of this up, and then I'll get back to you guys and show you guys the difference between the two, which is the mold lines being removed and the ones that's not removed. Okay, see you guys in a bit. Okay, everybody, so I'm back. I've gone ahead and cleaned off every single section or every piece of all its mold lines and clippings. So what we're going to go ahead and do now is start assembling the miniature. So I'm going to take my super glue. And a word of advice for you guys when you start assembling miniatures is try to remember that less is more. It's something that I've been preaching on my stream, and I've been telling a lot of painters and assemblers throughout my career of building and painting that less is more, right? You don't need to overdo it. With that being said, we don't want to take super glue on a miniature like this and put a huge, drop of super glue and let it sit there, because what will happen is once it dries, it'll hide some of the details. So all we need really is, let's go ahead with the base first. All we need is just a little bit of super glue. Okay, you don't really need a lot. Okay, we'll place that on the base. Okay, and I like using the professional liquid super glue from Loctite, just because once you put the miniatures together, it only takes like a couple seconds before it actually bonds together. Whereas if you're using like Gorilla Glue or some sort of gel glue, it takes a little bit more time before it cures. So keep that in mind as well when you guys are choosing your super glue or whatever you're using to model the pieces together. Okay, so we'll take the two halves of the Space Marine armor, okay, and we will just add a touch of glue, put the two halves together. Now, I've already cleaned these pieces up individually. However, what I like to do is I like to come back and clean this up after I glue it together. And the purpose and the reason for that is sometimes the two halves don't align perfectly. And as you'll see over here on the side, okay, there is a slight difference between the front half and the back half. So even though I cleaned up the model individually on the side of its mold lines and clippings, what I'll do is I'll come back in here and I'll actually scrape the two pieces off, or scrape that section off together. And the reason I scrape it is because the blade is pretty flat, and when you place it on the actual miniature on the two halves, one side is a little higher than the other. Basically, you're scraping that off until the blade touches both halves, and that's when you know you're going to have a nice even surface, so that when you're painting, you'll have less of a gap or a height difference where the ink or anything like that, the shades that you use, will actually pull up. So yeah, definitely take the extra time and go ahead and just clean up that section like so. So what we're going to do is we put the two halves together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assemble this miniature by putting the top or the torso to the body. Okay, as such. Okay, and all I have to let it do is just sit there for a split second. And then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll assemble the head as well. Now, obviously, the order in which you assemble these miniatures is really up to you. You can assemble them in any way you want. I just like to assemble it this way for myself. Okay, so there goes the torso, the legs, and the head or the helmet, right? The next thing I like to do is the arms next. And the reason I like to do arms next is because if you put the backpack on first, sometimes that'll get in the way. So here I'm going to add just a drop of glue, no more than that, and then we'll add the arm. Okay, so obviously the reason we want to clean up the miniature and clean the mold lines before assembly is because with the miniature already built in this fashion, it's really hard to get your knife or your file down into these areas to clean. It's doable, but it's a real pain to do. So I like to kind of get everything cleaned up before I put it together. That's one of the reasons why I had mentioned a good cleanup of prep work is important before assembling. Okay, so I added another dab here onto this side. We'll go ahead and place that together there. Okay. There we go. Okay, then the next thing I like to do afterwards is put the shoulder pads on. So again, just a dab of glue, and then just place the shoulder pad or the two pieces together. Okay. The next thing I'll do after that is going to be the backpack of the Marine. Like so. Okay, so pretty much your Marine is now completely built, or your model, your miniature. And I used the Space Marine as an example, but you can really use any model. It could be an Orc, Eldar, Tau, Infinity figure, Reaper. It really doesn't matter what miniature you guys are using, right? But what I wanted to really show off was the model preparation and assembly. Assembly can happen in any order, it's up to you. However, the prep work I feel is important, that you should clean up your mold lines and your clippings before assembly so that it's not as difficult to clean up afterwards. Now, with resin pieces, even pewter pieces, and even plastic, after you feel that you've cleaned off all the mold lines and you prime the miniature and get it ready for paint, sometimes the primer itself will show flaws in your cleanup. That's what primer is used for. They do it in the automotive industry where they use primer to see if there's any divots or dents or high spots. It's the same concept. So we've already cleaned off the model as much as we can that our eye can see right now. After we prime it, whether it be white, black, or gray, if you guys haven't seen my previous video, go ahead and check it out. I talk about primer in that series as far as for what color you want to have your overall miniature. But one of the things that I didn't mention really is using primer to see any defects on your models, such as mold lines or divots or chips or anything like that that you really don't want on your model. If you do see any mold lines or divots or anything like that after you primer it, you can go back in and clean it up again and fill in the gaps or whatever you see, any flaws that you see in the miniature before you start actually putting paint on it. So that's what I would call your preparation stage. Obviously this was my assembly stage where I put it together, but my preparation stage would be to make sure that my product or my miniature is fully ready before I start putting paint on it. Because once you start putting paints and shades on it, it will really accentuate and highlight all of your flaws. So that's why preparation stage is really important. So when you guys do put your miniature together, make sure that you guys really do take the extra time and care necessary in order to clean off all those mold lines. Okay, everybody wants to have a great looking army or models, right? So put some time into it. So in comparison here, I'll show you guys the two figures side by side. Okay, one, you guys can see that on the shoulder pad of the Marine on my right, you can see some clippings or little sections that I left that I did not clean off. Whereas to the model on my left, right around in this section here, I've already cleaned it up. You can see a little white there, but that's only because I ended up using the knife to clean up that section, but it's perfectly even. Once you primer it, you really won't see it. And again, it seems like there's something there, but once you primer it, you won't see the flaw in that, or you will see the flaw, right? So if I turn the miniature to its side here, same thing. You can see that there's a mold line right here on this leg here, whereas on this model here, there's nothing there. It's a nice smooth armor surface that once you start painting and shading, you won't see. Okay, so that's the miniature itself. I didn't go ahead and put the bolter on. Most of my Marines or miniatures, what I like to do is I like to make sure I have some sort of open space so that I can actually get the brush in to actually paint. Right? If you were to glue the weapon or whatever it is and you hide it, then it's very difficult to actually get in there and paint those sections. There are painters who actually do that. I sometimes do that as well, but if I can help it, I try not to cover up all of that detail. And that's part of the assembly phase as well. Planning ahead as far as for how you want to paint your miniature, what you want to be shaded and highlighted, and then leaving certain parts off. Other parts like the pouch over here and the pistol that you can put on the Marine, I'm gonna paint that separately before I actually put it on the model as well, so that way I can make sure I get into certain areas such as the sections in between the armor, like where the Space Marine is supposed to have the I don't know what you would call it, but this inside section over here, which is the joint area, that's the section where I want to make sure I get painted. But if I have other pieces or sections covering sections up like that, it's a little bit more difficult for me to get into. So I'm going to paint these separately before I put it on. Okay, so again, just as a recap, make sure that you guys use your clippers, right? Get as close to the sprue as possible on the sprue and clip off what you can. And then once you have all the pieces off, make sure you guys clean it up, whether you use an X-Acto knife, either by cutting or scraping. And if you don't want to use the X-Acto knife, you can use a file to file it down as well. But you want to have a clean miniature or surface where you don't have any mold lines. Mold lines is one of the banes of my existence. You know, it's the bane of my existence, having mold lines. It's really, really, for me as a painter, I don't appreciate mold lines because it does take a model that can be great and it downgrades it. So if you guys want to have your models look from good to great or amazing, definitely take the time to prep your models before priming and painting. Okay guys, with that, hopefully you guys enjoyed the series or this video. If you do like the video and what I have given you guys as an explanation, please hit that like button and maybe subscribe to my channel and check out some of my other how-to videos on painting and assembly and tabletop miniatures. Okay, and if you guys would also like to check me out, I usually stream in the evenings on Twitch as well. All of that stuff will be down below in the descriptions. Okay guys, thank you and enjoy painting and building. Take care guys.